Hello, everyone. Welcome to Getting to Know You. That is residents and staff, and sometimes special guests, the program here at Stonebridge. Welcome to a beautiful spring here at Stonebridge and all around us in our surrounding counties. You can see I'm sitting here with David McAlpin, and we will be taking our audience in confidence and say that at the last minute, David's computer didn't work, so he couldn't Zoom in with us. So you just walk upstairs in Stonebridge and sit down next to another resident, me, and we will be in conversation, thanks to Jock McFarlane, our wonderful videographer, with our special guest, Jim Waltman. Now, many of you may have met Jim informally, because in sort of college terms, Jim is a child of a resident. His mother, Dee Dee Waltman, and his father were here for many years. And we also have heard from Jim in a program. And Jim and David McAlpin have a wonderful connection as well. Jim is joining us. Wave, Jim. Okay. By Zoom, and he's arranged in the background to have the actual building in which the Watershed is now located. We're doing this program. This is a little longer introduction, David and Jim, but we're doing this program to provide a context for a new venture here at Stonebridge called Trailblazers. And tomorrow, we're taping this on Thursday, tomorrow, Friday, this Stonebridge hiking group will be setting out for the first time to explore trails in Somerset, Mercer, and Middlesex, which happens to be, Jim, pretty much the area that the Watershed covers. And so next week we will hear from them, and if you watch both programs, it will all fit together very nicely, I promise you. So we're going to be starting out with thinking about our environment in this tri-county region, which the Watershed has been doing for more than 75 years. And David, my guest here, can testify to that, right?
Yes.
Because your father was one of the founders, and I'm sure you had countless trips to the Watershed property during that time. Can you say a little bit about those early days, or what you learned from your father about, it is 75 years now, Jim?
Yes.
Very close to it, yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So, David, what do you remember about those early days?
I remember when my father learned and began to talk about the idea of organizing environmental groups by watershed. That is, each one would cover a drainage area called a watershed. And so he gathered some people, and I was among them. We organized the Stony Brook Millstone Watershed Association, and that was conceived to be a local environmental group. And it grew, and it gave birth to the organization that I wanted.
Oh, we talked about that, the DNR Greenway.
DNR Greenway,
Right.
which is focusing on the Delaware and Raritan Canal, and that particular part of the watershed. But the watershed continues to cover the larger area drained by Stony Brook and the Millstone River.
It happens that we could, as they would say, spit in the Millstone River from Stonebridge. You know, David, one of the things we talked about that confounded us both was that when your father and others started this, they talked about dams being required. And now we've been hearing from Jim that dams are not required. Is that a good introduction, Jim, for you to say a little bit about the changing environmental problems we face?
Sure. So back in those days, and we're talking about the 1950s and 60s, a big concern was the erosion of farm fields. Of course, if you've lived in this area for a while, you know that this central New Jersey area was just covered with farmland, and actually not as many trees back then, and certainly not as much development. But the wind would blow the fields into the streams. The soil would then create sedimentation in the streams, which harmed the streams. So there was a big program of finding places, mostly on smaller streams, to build what some refer to as check dams and little ponds to trap the sediment in. And those worked very well. Today, that's not as big a problem because we've allowed more forests to regrow along our streams. And many of the farms that still exist have kind of shelters around them that helps hold the soil. Farmers are more likely to use cover crops, so that erosion and sedimentation isn't as big an issue. The dams that we're now at the Watershed trying to remove, it's a very different purpose. It's to try to free the migratory fish, species like American shad and other herring, other fish in the herring family, to swim back up the Millstone River, which were blocked, believe it or not, for close to 300 years. But over the last half dozen years or so, there have been 4 dams removed on the Millstone and then the Raritan River. The Millstone flows into the Raritan on the way to the sea. And those fish, the American shad and others, are starting to make a comeback, which is pretty amazing and a wonderful thing to see. Right. And we hope that before too long, a dam at Blackwell's Mills, which is just a little bit north of Stonebridge, will removed, and you all can head outside on the wonderful trail around the grounds there, and you can wave at the shad as they migrate past Stonebridge on towards Princeton. If you're confused by what I'm saying, the Millstone River is one of those odd rivers, minority of rivers that flows from the south to the north. So when we say that fish are swimming upstream in the Millstone, that means they're swimming south.
Now, David mentioned that Stony Brook, and Stony Brook is probably known to probably more people here at Stonebridge than we realize, that realize the Millstone is right out in our backyard, because it flows over through Hopewell and into Princeton and into Lake Carnegie. Is that right, Jim?
That's exactly right. It starts in what we call the Sourland Mountains. It's a New Jersey mountain. It's not a very big mountain, in East and West Amwell, and flows down. It has its own circuitous route. It flows south into Hopewell, and then a little bit of Lawrence Township, and then on to Princeton and into West Windsor, kind of right on that line. And where the Stony Brook meets the Millstone River, that is now Lake Carnegie.
So,
yeah, you know, I was remiss. I wanted to tell another small story about another resident of Stonebridge.
Okay.
A gentleman named Tom Hartman, who passed away a few years ago, but Tom was a good friend of my parents. When David's father, back in 49 or 50, called a meeting to help create this organization, he called upon all the large landowners along the Stony Brook, one of those being the Hun School. And so he wrote a letter to the headmaster of the Hun School, who was not able to come, but Tom Hartman, who I believe was a pretty low-level faculty member, and he was a pretty humble guy. He referred to himself as a very low tier on the totem pole. But he showed up at that first meeting with your father, David. And I don't know that I've ever told you that story or that you knew Tom.
I
But
didn't know that.
that was a pretty interesting additional coincidence.
And so
And he
Tom
was-
turned out to be a big supporter.
He did.
Well, many people knew Martha because she was here until, sadly,
Yes.
very, very lately, and it's great. Well, just to finish up on the idea that David brought up about preservation, while I guess the Watershed had enough things to do, that getting another organization to do preservation was a really smart thing. And your own farm is now preserved under those circumstances, right, David?
It wasn't sure, it was done before
The Greenway?
the Greenway.
Oh,
yeah.
okay. Maybe one of the last that the Watershed did. And we won't go into it here, but I think there was always a commitment to education, because David and I were talking about Muriel Buttinger, who actually gave the property that we now think of as the Watershed, and was very involved. But her main occupation was to work in the Trenton schools as the school psychologist. And she had a very strong commitment. And I know the Watershed today has a strong commitment to both being active in the schools and with teachers, as well as having a summer camp that is overrun with kids.
Which makes our offices a very joyful place to work.
Right.
Of course, we're in the same boat as you all are with under COVID, so our building has been closed, but we're starting to do more programming for families outside.
Okay.
And as the weather warms, that'll continue. So, and you know, I want to say that we've mentioned David's father, but David himself was a terrific leader of the organization as our board chair. So that's a unique family commitment where both David and his father served as chairs of our board of trustees. And I believe combined, the two of you, David, served on our board for 35 years. So that's a pretty extraordinary amount of service. And we're very grateful to both you and your dad.
We're grateful that they established a strong organization that continues in that tradition. But I don't think we should ignore the fact that everything is perfect in our region, that we've done all the protection, all the preservation and so on, because that's clearly not the case. And I have to say that when I invited Jim to come on the program and do it by Zoom, he said, well, it's much better to do it in person, but I have to admit that Zoom is a really good way to communicate. And maybe that would be a good way of saying, well, what were you communicating to all of those municipalities who had to learn to not give up on environmental protection? And there are new things to be done. And you told me that it was much more efficient than showing up at the evening meetings of municipalities to talk to, what, 40, 50 municipalities at once. So what were you telling them? What should they do? What should we all do?
It's interesting that the biggest pollution problem in our area and most of New Jersey is not anymore the intentional discharge of pollution from factories and the direct discharge of raw sewage. We don't do that anymore. There's still contaminants, legacies have gone years. But the big problem today is stormwater runoff, or polluted runoff. It's the stuff that washes off our roads and parking lots and rooftops. And it's oils and antifreeze and pesticides and even pet waste and all these things. And so we've made a big push to work with towns to strengthen the protection of streams from development that takes place, to ensure that when a new building, shopping center, what have you, is constructed, that there's a effort to control the runoff that would otherwise pollute the streams. And Ingrid, it's unbelievable. We had 350 people on one call, and these were municipal engineers and planners and elected officials. And we were thrilled to be to have an audience of so many folks. Maybe they were bored, I don't know, but it was it was a very rigorous conversation.
No, I think
and Zoom
would
has
be
it's
very
you know
efficient.
it's very efficient, and it has allowed us to speak to towns from north to south, east to west in our state, which typically we can't. As you know, those municipal meetings can go late. So imagine yourself driving home if you're in a meeting in, say, Cape May, and it goes to 11 o'clock at night. That's a long drive home late at night, but we can get on this Zoom machine and speak out. Of course, I miss the theatrics of appearing before the committee and waving my arms and all those things, but it is super efficient, and we feel we've been able to expand our impact quite a bit, and not to mention all the towns around us, a couple dozen towns, including Montgomery Township, which recently strengthened its protections against stormwater pollution quite significantly. So we're very,
with all the development
grateful.
occurring around here. That's good to hear.
It is.
Yeah. Well, it's great to know that you are making that statewide impact from what started with your father thinking it was a local environmental organization, and here you're having all of New Jersey learn from your experiences. I think we should remind people in Stonebridge that it's not hard to visit the headquarters of the Watershed. All you need to do is get yourself on Princeton Avenue and just keep going, but don't go as far as Pennington. Turn right and then right again, and you are at the grounds of the Watershed, and there are trails there too. Is this a good time to show the pictures? Well,
I couldn't, I think Jock will eventually add them in.
Oh, okay.
I'm not able to add them, but I do want to.
Maybe you can just quickly describe what we're going to be seeing.
So you'll see some very nice images of our building on the outside, and you can see one behind me, and inside, including a wonderful photograph of David and me outside the McAlpin Library, which we dedicated just a couple years ago in honor of you and your father, David. You remember that day. And then we'll have some photos of the trails and a map. Montgomery, we are very fortunate that New Jersey, obviously there's a lot of people and a lot of development, but it's been a national leader in protecting and preserving open space. And I believe about 40% of Montgomery Township is now preserved permanently.
And we appreciate it,
And there's a lot of wonderful places to go out and see and hike. The Watershed has been building a boardwalk. I should add that, which makes it a lot easier to get around on our trails. And so that's if you're looking for an easy hike on a nice elevated boardwalk.
But that's not open now yet, right?
That is open.
It is open.
We haven't completed it, but it goes about 1,000 feet, which is not a nice little walk. So.
Good. Well, thank you, David, to you and your pioneering efforts and your continued support. I mean, they're dedicating a library to you. You must still be very active there. And I'm glad that we're sitting here as co-residents, being able to share in the bounties. And next week we'll have to hear from our trailblazers of what they did and what they will do. And we hope they'll watch this so they'll have some idea of the region, and that we can't give up on protecting it. There's so many things that we need to be doing to make sure that your father and your legacy really lives on and is enjoyed by generations to come. So for today, that's the first part of getting to know you. Thank you so much, Jim, for joining us and giving us that regional perspective. And thank you to David for what you've already done through your family, but also for, I know how much you enjoy being here in the grounds and
Okay.
knowing that they're part of the preservation.
Yes.
So
Ingrid,
we'll
thank
tune
you
in
for,
next.
yeah, I just want to say thank you for reaching out to me and having me in this format. And I just want to thank Stonebridge and all the friends there who were so kind towards my parents. They had a wonderful time there. They were part of that pioneering group that
Right.
moved in the first year. And it really was a blessing for the last years of their life to be in that wonderful place. So thank you.
I know people were so happy to be friends with them in their stay here at Stonebridge. So thank you, and stay tuned. Next week, we'll talk a little bit more about the region and how people are enjoying it. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, David.
You're
Thank you.
welcome.
And thank you to Jock for arranging it all. See you again. Bye.